Our next presenter, Leesa Fawcett. Leesa lives beside the Nottawasaga River, along the spine of the Niagara Escarpment and Hockley Valley, with a varied assortment of rescue, wild, companion, and feral beings. She forged the study of critical human-animal studies at York University. She teaches courses and advises wonderful students in animal studies, environmental philosophy and advocacy, critical environmental education, children's studies, and natural history. Current projects include a multi-year collaborative study of human-wildlife encounters in the Greater Toronto area, and research on political ecology of the interspecies friendships and empathy. Leesa is an associate dean and coordinator of the graduate diploma in environmental education at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University here in Toronto.
Big thank you to Sue Reddick and the team, particularly Nicole, the U of T team, and all the previous speakers. I've really enjoyed the talks today, and thank you so much for staying late into the day and staying awake. My talk will riff off a number of other people's talks. This, of course, is part of a 6-year collaborative research project with Sue Reddick and the rest of the team to understand human-animal encounters and contact zones in Toronto. And I think a lot of the significance lies in the fact that the Greater Toronto Area, which some of you have already talked about, is one of the fastest growing urban regions in North America. It's got this vast ravine system, proximity to the Great Lakes, the Niagara Escarpment, and the GTA also supports key regional and continental wildlife migration corridors and diverse, really globally valued habitats. So one of the thesis I'm going to work with today is that in urban encounters with other wild animals, the precarious nature of living, our vulnerability, ours as humans and theirs as other animals, is faced daily, and the idea and the enactment of what it would mean to live convivially can help us imagine otherworldly relations. And this really does rip off of other people's work. So I'm going to make 4 main points. One is that to be alive is to be vulnerable to each other. The human and the more than human in our varying but linked environments, we're always vulnerable. Among other things, we are vulnerable to each other. And across, the second point, across different divides of pollution, purity, and private property. And by pollution, I mean contamination, where things that are out of place are considered a pollutant because they're not where they should be. And that's often animals, as people have spoken about animals in urban environments. And then the whole purity issue, what gets to be counted as what should be there, and the species hierarchies that entails. And the issue of private property, which is huge because people's private property gives them abilities to do certain things on that property. And these things get played out across those different divides in cities. And these ideas about our vulnerability and precarious nature of being alive can often create violent conditions of living together in large urban areas. It doesn't have to, but often it does. For humans to humans and humans to animals, it's not something that just happens between humans and animals. The third point I'm going to be talking about is that values permeate all of our animal encounters. And more importantly right now for us, as we've seen, ethics can shift. And they can shift, and when they do shift, they can create alternate emotions, alternate thought, attitudes, and importantly, alternate actions too. And those often come as packages. The fourth point I'm going to talk about is that crossing the convivial cohabitation that I'm sort of working towards, and many of us are in this room, already exists. It's not new. It already exists in many places. It has existed in the past. It's just about growing the scale of it, I think, in urban centers. And to grow it and nurture it is to reimagine and enact other relationships. And it is in the act of doing that that we renew these other relationships. And we renew a kind of applied ethics. And in particular, we learn new things together across species. So where are we? We're in the mega city of Toronto, world city of Toronto. It was known as Toronto the Good in recent history when I was growing up. When my grandparents were growing up, it was known as Hog Town. And long before colonization, it was known as Toronto, which is it's an Iroquois word that means where there are trees standing in the water. And many First Nations people traveled seasonally to spend spring and summer fishing on the shores of Lake Ontario and gathering and hunting in the surrounding woodlands. So lots of other cultures and societies have lived here before we have the city as it is now, a wonderfully multi-diverse city. So in this short ensuing time, even from my grandparents' time, urban wildlife encounters have really changed drastically. Horses used to pull carts on the streets. When I lived with my grandparents, there was a chained bear that guarded a nearby lumber yard, which was bizarre to begin with. And dogs roamed freely, which of course they don't anymore. And long before that, of course, Toronto was home to woolly mammoths. We talk about rewilding, caribou, moose, wolf, fox, wolverine, bears, passenger pigeons, to name just a few of inhabitants. I mean, this is one specific time and in place. So there are a multitude of encounters between humans and more than human animals in the Toronto area, and we've been talking about those encounters. I mean, we encounter animals in our dreams and in our imaginations, and also walking down the street, so it's not just always the physical encounter, but I am going to focus on that physical encounter. People encounter wildlife in their backyards quite commonly, as we know from the Toronto Wildlife Centre, when they're walking their dog, driving their cars, pushing a stroller, just to name a few. And these encounters are often unexpected, unplanned, and inconvenient to the person's daily schedule. Sometimes the encounters are breathtaking. Sometimes they're tinged with gentleness and care. Other times they're full of apathy. Other times they're full of anger, anxiety, and even violence. And often other beings are watching these encounters. So I don't want us to think of these encounters as happening in isolation. Other beings are watching them happen too. So when I think about precarious and aliveness, we know life forms are meeting in an everyday way, in ways that it's possible every day if one attends with your senses. And of course, Ramsey's touched on that. So they're not exotic encounters. Or is that what they're actually becoming in urban areas? So the anomaly strikes us as wrong, as these increased encounters in urban areas strike us as something that shouldn't be happening, that is out of order, that is a form of contamination or pollution from the way things should be. I mean, we've talked about the common scenario with people mistaking fallen birds as abandoned young, or trying to rescue them when they're really just fledglings, learning to fly and get by on their own. And people are moved by the opportunity, able to get much closer to an animal than they would normally. And they can get an intimate view. And there is a desire for that, to see something close up, an aliveness close up, let alone to touch it, which of course we don't want them to do. The people who call the Toronto Wildlife Centre, from the little bit that I know, or any other animal rescue organization, as Sue pointed out, the different organizations in Toronto, they can be enacting a multitude of different relations, right? I mean, they can be doing it because they're good citizens and they want this animal to be protected. They can be doing it to enact rescue fantasies. Something needs rescuing, I must rescue it. Whether that animal needs rescuing or not, they could be trying to rid their private property of unwanted animals. So far from the TWC work that we've learned about, the encounters vary a tremendous amount, as Natalie and Erin have talked about, in terms of their intensity, the attitudes towards the animals, and the outcomes. And not surprisingly, as people have already said, endearing animals such as baby mammals generally fare better than animals with well-known defenses like skunks, or disliked animals such as bats, which I'm going to talk about more in particularity. As we know from the wonderful talk that Joyce gave last night, one of the preferred ways of dealing with bats is to kill it with a tennis racket. And actually, John talked about this being a sport when we were talking last night with young boys doing it under streetlights. Now, this is a very particular socio-cultural event, killing the bat with a tennis racket, and certainly one I grew up with. At the same time, it's a socially constructed attitude and set of behaviors in China, where I visited. You get birthday cards. I got a birthday card with bats on it, which is an auspicious thing to give you, because bats bring blessings, which of course is not the attitude that I grew up with in Toronto with bats. And in my own history and in Ojibwe knowledge, which discovered echolocation, this is a sort of cheer for Ojibwe traditional knowledge, long before science discovered echolocation. Of course, bats have a completely different standing in terms of all my relations and how all the relations are interrelated and need to be kept whole in order to have a good life and a kind life and to travel the sweetgrass road. So, if killing is not your choice and you call a pest removal company and they relocate the animal, that's better than killing it, obviously, but extraordinary possibilities for truly encountering another are lost. You've moved something out of where it was, you've moved it out of your life, you've moved it out of that relational possibility. So I wonder, what are the conditions of possibility that need to exist for human and animals to learn from each other in city settings? Being can often be quite confounded, and staying with the state of feeling perplexed or mystified or unsure about another being is one of those conditions of possibility. Certainty doesn't always create an open conditions of possibility. And Judith Butler, who doesn't really care that much about animals, although she's thinking about maybe caring about animals, but I do like the way she thinks about the other. She wrote, "For if I'm confounded by you, then you are already of me, and I am nowhere without you. I cannot muster the we, except by finding the way in which I am tied to you, by trying to translate, but finding that my own language must break up and yield if I am to know you. You are what I gain through this disorientation and loss. This is how the human comes into being again and again and again, as that which we have yet to know." And that's why I think these relationships and encountering urban wildlife have so much to offer us. Even if it is in fear, that's still a relational possibility that makes us more human, can enlarge our humanity and capacity for life, can shrink it, can ignore it, can do lots of other things to it. Levinas says that the face of the other, in its precariousness and defenselessness, is for me at once the temptation to kill and the call to peace, that you shall not kill. Of course, in Toronto, we've had, I wondered if Suzanne was going to talk about this, but we've had people are violent towards raccoons, and it's, as she said, it often has to do with damage. Her survey showed damage to private property is sort of exponentially connected to the urge to kill and to make it go away. This is a very complicated case for me in many ways. I think it goes across race, class, all sorts of things. And I know that Aaron has talked about this, but this is a man who, Dong Yung Yen, I'm probably saying that wrong, who pleaded guilty to animal cruelty in connection with an attack on a family of raccoons in his own backyard, which he brutally harmed and killed some of them with his shovel. They were in his garden, which he was concerned about. And he was sentenced to pay $1,365 in restitution for vet care and do 100 volunteer hours at an animal shelter. This kind of violence happens, of course, when I think Jamie was asking the question about homeless people. When we think about humane education or humane, even the word, humans are not always, as we were talking about in our reading group, humans are not always humane with each other, and not everyone gets to count equally as human, let alone willing to give them humane treatment. So Derrida talks about how in this era of globalization there's a new kind of violence, and that this kind of violence requires us, he says, to, quote, continue to interrogate all the limits we thought pertained to life between the living and the dead, but also between that living being called human and the one called animal. And I think that's what everyone in this room is doing in very different ways, which I think is wonderful. And he also talked about, and Derrida and others argue it's impossible to deny the suffering of certain animals. You think of industrial agriculture, labs, etc., and the acceleration of some of the compassionless technological treatment of animals. And he calls this a sort of war between humans and animals. And one of the things I worry about in this, and I think it is true in many ways, that there is an apathy about treatment towards animals across different things, that we kill off our own compassion, and we're not required to have compassion for parts of ourselves and other humans and other animals. So he talks about how we're amidst a violence against the living that is global and limitless. This isn't the most positive talk. Anyways, I want to go back to the city and private property. City work, of course, is grounded in the idea that displaced, there's a beautiful book by Nixon about slow violence, because I think that was fast violence, the man attacking raccoons in his backyard. But there's all sorts of slow violence, which of course, when you think of pathogens and things that enact on bodies over a long period of time. And Nixon talks about how this idea that displaced and dispossessed beings can readily be cast as uninhabitants. I mean, homeless people are uninhabitants, and lots of animals, and which ones, which I'm sure we're going to get to by the end of this conference, are constantly cast as uninhabitants. And what does it mean to be an inhabitant who's made into an uninhabitant? And the criteria for dwelling can often be overridden, obviously, by the legal logic of private property and the kind of slow violence that this entails. Now, bats Bats are an interesting one altogether because of the ethical shifts that are possible and have happened with bats. One of the questions I'm wondering about is who has access to spaces to flourish in urban settings, and how do we secure those spaces? Bats in Toronto were cast as uninhabitants for most of my growing up and time before that, and in recent time they were made killable, hence the tennis racket. I worked in a bat lab for a long time, although I was a social scientist in the bat lab, but one of the things that we were doing in that lab was we always had to do public education every week, and we got called to different things. And we got called to one school that had a huge assembly. All the children were called into the public school assembly, and in the middle of that, a little brown bat flew through the auditorium, and a teacher stomped it to death in front of 500 children, which is violent. And it's 500 children watching that. And it's little brown bats are called little brown bats because they're pretty little. I mean, this isn't a Dracula-sized, blood-sucking thing that's coming at you. And so we went into the school to then do some education. I mean, the kids needed trauma stuff more than they needed us to talk about bats at first. But the notion of this ethical demand that Butler talks about that the other makes, and she says it is that vocalization of agony that is not yet language or no longer language, the one by which we are awakened to the precariousness of the other's life. So children certainly witnessed that. They witnessed the vulnerability and precariousness of one animal's life in a public school assembly. At the same time, I did a study with about 400 children years ago, and one of the things I did was children drew stories and did problem solving and did surveys and did all sorts of stuff around common and familiar animals, bats, frogs, and raccoons. And I'll show you, this is one of the drawings from a 10-year-old, he was 9 at the time, a 9-year-old boy, before he'd seen a bat and what he thought a bat would do to him and what it would look like. And first of all, look at the size of the bat compared to his head. He's a good cartoonist, so that's clear there. And look at the fangs on the bat, of course. And then I showed him a bat. I showed the whole class a bat. And this was the drawing after. And I didn't do any intervention. I didn't teach them anything. I just brought the bat in, the live, living bat. I had to catch them the night before and then take them in and release them. But just so that they could see what it was. And it's just that embodied being, without even a big lecture or anything, but that experiential education that is only that caused, in this case, and actually was statistically significant, because I was doing it in ANOVA, but an ethical shift in the attitudes of the children, and in particular how the children solved problems with animals. Because I would ask them problem-solving questions with each of the animals, how they would solve it, how their parents would solve it, how their best friend would solve it, and that statistically changed once they had seen the animal. So I think that these ethical shifts are really important, and the one way to make that happen is, of course, with education, critical kind of experiential education. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bats that we do have in the city and biosemiotics, which of course is, not of course, but biosemiotics is a sign system and thinking about sign systems, because I think one of the things we've lost is our ability to read the signs from other animals. And certainly in terms of natural history, it's something I'd really like to see mandated across the curriculum if I could. And this is obviously it's a bat, but this is a little brown bat. The main ones we're going to get in Toronto right now are little brown bats and big brown bats, which I'll talk about a bit. But when you think of biosemiotics, which is really, as Dealey talks about it, it's a doctrine of signs that sort of transcends, as he says, transcends the opposition of culture to nature, which is where I want to be. And it precludes this kind of linguistic or only literary way of communicating. It can be bodily language, all sorts of other language. To illustrate this, I'm going to draw on Paul Shepard's book. He talks about the others, how animals made us human. It excavates this long history of how becoming human happened in relation to other animals and ecological communities in seasonal time. He says, we're latecomers in a well-established process that had gone on for 50 million years. The four-legged carnivores and their prey had long since learned that an animal, watched long enough, gradually dissolved into signs. It left the marks that came to represent it: footprints, urine, secretions, feces, antlers, scratchings, rubbings, diggings, nest tracks, and bits of fur, as well as an immense range of sounds and smells, some of them unavailable to us. Language and art meant that those signs as objects could be transported, so that kind of shared world where those things were possible. I'm going to skip any more on the biosemiosis because I want to get back to the bats. So bodies speak to each other in languages unknown to us and known to us and experienced by us without always the words to explain what's happening. And at the bequest of subjects in those bodies and in that inner subjective space they find themselves in. And I think to lose the opportunity, the learning, the capacity, and the ability to speak to other animals and other animal bodies is a form of slow violence, much in the same way that Rob Nixon was talking about it. And it's one of those kinds of slow violence we won't know until we're at the end of it. And of course, endangerment, the bats I'm dealing with, the little brown bat, and are on the endangered species list. So we're already now caring about them. There's been an ethical shift, but they're endangered, and we shouldn't have to get to this point before we start to notice them. And of course, as Aaron pointed out to me, the media's had a huge role in this. The media used to demonize bats, and now bats are not demonized in the same way. So given that bat species such as the little brown bat, the Myotis, and the big brown, the Aptesicus, are listed as endangered species in terms of their Canadian and Ontario conservation issues, I wonder what our responsibilities are then. Does this knowledge of their population vulnerability, what actions ethically does that call forth from us? TWC has made the conditions possible for care to exist and for ethical shifts to be enacted. I mean, that's one of their gifts to us, and we've been able to look at some of that data, and often these shifts come at the expense of endangered life, and how bats are endangered, and we're changing our attitudes. That's a big brown bat and a Aptesicus. Of course, bats, there used to be a plenitude of bats, and now we have this much smaller number of bats. And I won't talk about white nose syndrome because Joyce talked about that last night, but bats are a very social mammal. Most mammals are social, but just differently social. And you can see the white nose syndrome on some of them there, which of course is leading to their, we think is leading to their, we know it's leading to their deaths. When we look at the data that Tracy and Justin were good enough to make sense of from the Toronto Wildlife Centre, it's hard to know exactly what we're seeing all the time. These are the encounters where people have encountered a bat and brought it in and called the Toronto Wildlife Centre, and it's been brought to the Toronto Wildlife Centre. So in 2006, 154 bats were brought in. Now to me, this is a form of, they're not killing them, they're not phoning a pest removal company, they're making the effort to call the TWC and to have the TWN to rearrange their schedules to come and get this bat for whatever reason, whether it's flying around their house or it's underneath their shutter, or so that's interesting to me. And that was in 2006. Now remember, bat populations are declining over this period, although they decline quite precipitously in a very short amount of time. And then you look at the next in 2007, and it's gone up. There's 266 bats that are being phoned in. Now, this is hopeful for me because it is a kind of circle of compassion and care and action. It's not just talking about it, where they've actually moved on this. And then, of course, in 2013, I mean, this is when our bat species were really plummeting hugely, and now they're even lower. But the number of bats is so much lower, and you still have 38 being brought in. That's more to do with the extinction of the bats. So drawing on these notions of multi-species flourishing, our ethical responsibility, I think, is to contribute. One of them is to contribute to reimagining living together, convivial cohabitation in cities through attention to the natural histories of the animals, the learning, the reviving the new urban biosemiotics, phrenologies, which is about learning about seasons. Like there's a systems, Batesonian, he's retired now, systems theorist, who told me that in 1940, I think he said, all the school children had to learn about pollinators, and they had to know the pollinators in their neighborhood. And that recalls the kind of notion of a community ethic too, I think, where you're responsible for where you live in a way in terms of the care and the making sense of what's around you. One of the other examples in Toronto, just to leave you with the positive things that we can grow, is the Urban Bat Project that runs out of Hyde Park. And it's a very exciting community-based, I would argue, a community ethic initiative that is trying to support conservation overall, but stewardship in general, and it's particularly of bats in Hyde Park. There's a lot of Aptesicus in Hyde Park. And they run bat walks, so they do a number of different things, because of course we learn in different ways. So they do bat walks so people can go out and can aesthetically understand how a bat's world might be lived. They monitor the bats in the park, so they're collecting data of their own community. And also what I love is they have a bat library, a lending library, which is a bat monitor lending library. Because in order to listen to a lot of the bats, most of the bats, they echolocate above our hearing. So you need a bat translator, transducer. And they have a lending library where you can go and take them out instead of a book. But it is a book because it's teaching you about another form of communication in life. It's sharing the city with you as it is, and declining numbers. So I'll leave you there, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Leesa. Open it up for any questions.
Are there any bat hotspots in the city? Places to see, if you want to see bats, what are some of the best
I mean, I would go to High Park.
High Park,
Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
I thought so.
You can see, well, now that they've declined, you used to be able to see them pretty easily in different areas, especially under really bright lights that would attract moths, and then you'd see the bats coming in to eat the moths. But with the decline in populations, it's probably best to go, because you also don't want to disturb them. So to go with somebody in High Park right now. It used to be there were so many that I would take walks with students and children when I did children's natural history, and you could throw a pebble up in the air and bats would swoop in thinking it was a flying insect and then realize it wasn't, but they'd come close enough so that everyone would get a good look, but that doesn't work so well right now.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful. I'm really curious about the drawing process that you went through with the children. What were some of the other drawings like when you showed, the before and after, before showing them the bat versus after, and also how did they react to the other animals? Like, did you show them the raccoon as well, or et cetera, or?
I did the same thing with all of them. So there was a control group, and then there was the children who, the control group just saw a plant, and that was interesting in and of itself. And then all the other children in the other groups saw either they saw the bat, the raccoon, which had to go catch each other, and the frog. Frog was easy. But to your question about the drawings, the drawings were fascinating, and I didn't. In order to analyze them, I had to do a lot of reading because I didn't want to do a kind of psychoanalytic analysis of the chimney means. They hate their father. So I sort of pared it down. I would ask the children what it meant, and then I would write down, and my team would write down whatever the children said it meant, and then we would look at the pictures. And I did a study. There was about 250 4- and 5-year-olds and 250 9- and 10-year-olds. So kids who just came into school in kindergarten, and kids in grade 5. Because I wanted to see what they learned over that period of time. Because the idea is, for most of the literature, that if you increase people's knowledge, then you increase their positive attitudes. But that didn't turn out to be true at all. But the younger kids, what amazed me was their drawings of the bats were much more realistic. The bat, and they're 4 and 5. But so their sense of their body and the sense of the bat were much more proportional. They were much less afraid, which also fear makes things bigger. So the older children, the bats were bigger. And yeah, it was very interesting. And the younger children had really different perspectives. Like when they would tell, they also told stories. So they'd tell a story where they would say, they had a much bigger kinship imaginary, which is what came out at the end. I mean, they didn't call it that, but I had to kind of come up with some label. They would say things like, oh, I met a bat. This is a 4-year, we went for a walk. Then we got hungry and I had a peanut butter sandwich, but the bat couldn't eat that because it needed insects, so we got some insects. Like they had a sense the animal had other needs other than theirs, which was very interesting. Whereas the older children with more knowledge had a lot. They had more fear and a lot of attitudes that were very negative, which were cultural currency at the time. So they learned those at the same time. The younger children also had really, for an architect, they had amazing perspectives. Like there'd be a child looking on the ground at the underbelly of a bat, and that would be its drawing. It's really interesting. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Do you know there's an ongoing education program? Or do you know there's an ongoing education program for children?
About bats?
About the wildlife in general? Or bats, or anything?
Certainly a lot of different NGOs offer them in different centers, like Wildlife Centers, the Court Rights Center. the Hyde Park Nature Center. So different nature centers have wildlife programs that I know of. I don't live in the city, I live outside the city, but I know there's lots where I live too. And parks run them. They're certainly on the decline.
So I'm just wondering, you were talking about the white nose disease in the,
White nose syndrome,
in the
yeah.
context of their communication.
No, sorry, I didn't explain that.
So maybe I just used.
No, I mean, they're dying because of white nose syndrome, which is a fungus that's been introduced, and there's all sorts of different theories about how they got that. A lot of people think it's from the smokers and the caves coming in on the foods, but anyways. No, that slide was because they're so social that when one is ill,
Right.
it's, yeah,
Okay,
spread.
then it's spread.
Yeah, yeah.
So they don't communicate by touching each other.
Oh, they touch each other a lot. Yeah, there's
Oh.
bats, yeah, there's lots of sexual activity, there's a lot of touching.
That's what
Well, surprisingly. I'm sure that's where you were going.
it was.
One more. Go ahead.
The shift in attitude towards bats is like nothing else out there with regard to wildlife. Why? And why hasn't it generalized to other species?
But, John, I think this goes to your minimum ethic. I think it's a shift because they're dying. I mean, they're
But the
almost...
shift occurred a long time ago.
No, the shift, I don't think so. I think the shift started to occur when it started to occur and then reached more of, that's a good question, I don't know. But I think that it has more to do with the fact that they're disappearing. Like, because you look at some place like the UK, which I don't know that well, but where bats are seen more favorably as far as I can tell from the literature. But and we were talking about this in terms of foxes also in the UK, where they have more favorable programs than we do, where there's not as many. I think unfortunately we don't pay attention until they're going away. It's not very helpful either. But that's why the education is important.
Like regarding that, do you think that the issue of rabies further affects that image? Because I think compared to raccoon and fox, who can easily get rabies, but the Ministry of Natural Resources works so diligently to have basically eradicated rabies in those populations, but you don't hear much about bats in that issue.
I think there is and has been a huge amount of fear around bats and rabies, which is really misplaced. Bats carry rabies. You're more likely to get rabies from a cow biting than from a bat. It's just not. We still don't want to be bitten by a bat. Nobody should be handling them so that they get bitten. But in terms of the incidence of people getting rabies, it's not very common.
Maybe one more.
I just want to make one quick point, and that's that I think the shift in ethics, and it goes to the rabies thing, and it goes back to an earlier conversation about monsters. I think they were seen as monsters, and hence the rabies was attached to them. They're blood-sucking. There's no blood-sucking bats in Canada. So they're a monstrous thing, and then in order to become more darlings or more beloved, that monstrousness has changed.